We'll be going live. Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kezia Lillenstein. I'm part of the SA Tide team responsible for bringing you all here today. And I'd just like to say how wonderful it is to have so many people here giving their time and their energy to this event. And before we begin, I would just like to have a nod to our funders, the British High Commission and the National Treasury. Thank you. Welcome to the first installment of the SA Tide and Econ 3x3 policy debate series. We are thrilled to have you here as we embark on this journey of advancing knowledge, informing policy decisions, and promoting sustainable economic growth in South Africa. In the face of South Africa's crisis of unemployment, rising public debt, and the lingering impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on an already fragile economy, policy-related research is more crucial now than ever. This is why SA Tide and Econ 3x3 are joining forces to create a platform where research findings can be effectively utilized and disseminated to make a tangible impact on informed policy making. Today's debate focuses on rethinking traditional approaches to unemployment in South Africa, exploring feasible and well-designed ground-based approaches to unemployment to complement active labor market policies. All of us here today will engage in the widespread debate around the topic. We will delve into the effectiveness of ground-based approaches. We will analyze their relevance in the developing country context. And of course, we will discuss the related budgetary implications of these tools. We are honored and very thankful to have an esteemed panel here with us today who will contribute their insights and spark constructive debate. We once again extend our warmest welcome to all participants present, as well as those who have joined us online. Thank you for being a part of this important conversation. So I'm going to hand over immediately to Steve Koch to do the welcoming remarks. He is the Professor and Head of Department of Economics here at the University of Pretoria. Thank you to our gracious host for having us, and let me hand over to you now, Steve.
Sorry, we're trying to sort out the echo. First of all, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to Future Africa, a platform on the University of Pretoria's campus to have these sorts of conversations and these sorts of debates. When the people in charge envisioned this institution that we are sitting in now, that was their goal, to try to make things happen in Africa and have these kinds of debates and policy discussions. So it's wonderful to have that. Better off. It's off. I don't think it turns off. Okay. So let me start over. I'd like to welcome the Chilitsa Marwala and Kunal Sen from UNU-WIDER. We have a number of diplomats and folks from the IMF. the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, and distinguished guests. This is going to be a wonderful event. We have a great panel of speakers who I don't have to introduce, but somebody else will. And we're going to have a nice discussion about how to hopefully solve at least a couple problems that we all know that we have here in South Africa. So I welcome you. I hope that you all get a chance to engage in the conversation that we're likely to have. And all the best to our panelists.
Sanibonani. Dumelang. Abusheni. Dimasiari. Goeiedag. Middag. Thank you very much. As I was coming here, I thought I was going to have somebody repeat after everything that I have said, because the people who came before me, there was an echo. In my culture, when a chief speaks, you just repeat what they have said, you know? So I thought it was just the fourth industrial revolution way of showing respect. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed my honor to welcome you to this event on behalf of the United Nations University. My name is Chirizima Rwara, and I am the new rector of the United Nations University, straight from the box. The UN University is an autonomous organ of the UN General Assembly. We serve as an independent global think tank and postgraduate teaching organization that contributes to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. UN University's headquarters are in Tokyo, which is my new home. Konnichiwa. But the UN University system is composed of 13 institutes located in 12 countries. And just last week, we have added an additional one. Now it is 14. We have an AI institute that we are building in Bologna, in Italy. One of the oldest of these institutes is actually UNU-WIDER, the UN University World Institute for Development Economics Research. UNU-WIDER is based in Finland, but it has a very important program right here in Pretoria, known as SA-TIDE, South Africa Towards Inclusive Economic Development. I am delighted that UNU-WIDER has a program in South Africa, because the work they are doing is meaningful, but also for some personal reasons. Although my home is now in Tokyo, some of you might have guessed that I am actually not Japanese. I am from the Limpopo province, about 400 kilometers north of where we are. And before my current role at the United Nations, I used to be a vice chancellor of the University of Johannesburg. And I tell my people in Tokyo that every time I hear somebody singing, I get a little bit nervous. Of course, when you are the vice chancellor in South Africa, you know what it means when you hear people singing. But it is great to be home again. I actually arrived at 9 o'clock this morning, so I am quite happy to be back home. I am proud to witness the collaborative efforts that bring together researchers, policymakers, and institutions dedicated to driving positive change in South Africa and beyond. Today, as we gather here, our shared commitment to inclusive growth, and economic transformation resonate strongly. I take pride in the strides we have achieved. The partnerships forged through this initiative have indeed shown great promises. Together, we are creating an environment that fosters innovation, research, and meaningful policy intervention that will shape the trajectory of South Africa. Now, what is SA Tide? Now, a brief note of what some of you may be wondering. What is this SA Tide program? Under SA Tide, experts from UNU-WIDER work closely with key staff from the South African government, particularly at the National Treasury and Revenue Authority, SARS, to co-create research, capacity development, and policy bridging initiatives. Thanks to SA Tide, researchers now have access to comprehensive, anonymized text data made available by SARS through the National Treasury Secure Data Facility. Data and evidence are imperative for countries to effectively develop and assess policies. And South Africa has emerged as a regional leader in data collection, boasting robust institutions dedicated to research-oriented data collection. By making text administrative microdata accessible for research, South Africa has positioned itself as a pioneering force in big data research for development. And of course, the institutes that we just launched in Italy that deals with artificial intelligence and big data would actually be quite useful, because it is located at the same place as the biggest supercomputer facility in Europe. Of course, this vast data that this program is working with places South Africa in a unique position compared to other developing and emerging economies. The United Nations University is honored to be a partner in this initiative and to be part of the collaborative efforts driving positive change in South Africa. With that background out of the way, let us turn our attention to what brings us here today. With the current South African crisis of unemployment, public debt, and the lingering impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on an already fragile economy, policy-related research is more crucial than ever. Of course, South Africa's problems are much wider than this. The issue of energy, certainly when I left in February, it was a problem, and I was informed that it is still an issue that needs to be resolved. And it is an issue that will involve a good understanding of the political, technological economy. How do these three aspects work together? Because if we do not untangle that, we are going to be complaining about energy poverty many, many years in the future. Together, the SA Tide program and the online publication Econ 3x3 are working to create platforms where research findings can be disseminated effectively to inform policymaking. This is the first installment of the Econ 3x3 and SA Tide policy debates series. We hope the series will increase engagement between policymakers and serve as a platform to robust discussions on critical policy matters that have profound impact on South Africa. Today's topic is rethinking traditional approaches to tackling unemployment in South Africa, exploring feasible, well-designed grant-based approaches for the unemployed to complement active labor market policies. I would like to thank the key users of the research, policymakers, and technical staff in government who have closely worked with SA Tide and are joining us today. I would also like to thank the leading academics at local universities who have supported SA Tide, including the University of Cape Town, the University of Stellenbosch, the University of the Free State, and the University of Pretoria, where we are today. We look forward to further strengthening these relationships as we continue our collective efforts. Now, before I sit down, there are a number of issues that I would like to put to your attention. This is really my opinions. First, I think we are reaching a stage where the grants in South Africa are simply unaffordable. I think with over 15 million people who are in one form of a grant or another, and Michael, you can agree with me or disagree with me, I actually think this is unaffordable. So whatever policies that we need to put into place, they have to be based on getting people to work. Let's get people to go and work. Secondly, we live at a time where the future of work is unknown and complicated, and we simply do not know how the economy, certainly the labor market, is going to look like in 20 years' time. And of course, many of these developments have been accelerated by artificial intelligence. I actually did a PhD in artificial intelligence from 1997 to 2000 at the University of Cambridge. I did not foresee the scale at which it was going to disrupt the economy. And for those of us who are studying this quite closely, it is pretty clear that a lot of jobs are going to disappear. What we do not know is whether the jobs that are going to be created are going to at least be equal to the jobs that are going to be destroyed. And then the third thing that I would like to leave you with is that it is clear that we need a new form of education, a new form of economy, and I am not campaigning for any position in South Africa, a new form of politics. We need political leaders who actually understand the economy, who understand technology, because if they don't, then they are going to lead us into temptations and deliver us to poverty. And then the fourth thing that I would like to leave you with is that now more than ever before, the seamless interaction between the public and the private sector is necessary. It is clear that much of the knowledge that we see lies in private hands. And how do we create a system that will ensure that there is a seamless flow of knowledge and expertise between the public and the private sector? There are a number of issues that I'm thinking about. I think we should introduce the concept of sabbatical, where people who are in government must go and spend time in industry and see how it works, and vice versa. I think that is quite important. Then the last thing that I would like to leave with you is that education, research, and development are going to be the key pillars that are going to define this new economy. And if you do not effectively invest, and if you do not effectively perform in this, then the future indeed is going to be bleak. Finally, I would like to thank all of you from the general public who have joined us today. Your interest and engagement on these important issues is invaluable. I'm looking forward to a thought-provoking discussion and a continued spirit of partnership with the National Treasury, SARS, I still need to file my taxes, and our supporters, UK, FCDO, and the European Union. Thank you once again for participating in this event and honoring our invitation. Ngiyabonga, bayadanki, ndiyalibuwa, enkosi.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Murray Leibrand. I'm the Director of the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. But in particular, I'm a Senior Research Fellow of UNU-WIDER, and I have the privilege of running one of the work streams as part of SA Tide, a work stream on labour markets and inequality. Who have taken the lead in convening today's event. Thank you very much for being with us today. Many of you have been with us in this engagement over leveraging, as Professor Marwala was just saying. It's all hands on deck. And we've been trying to leverage the collective strength of our researchers doing good research, and the policy researchers working in the interstices of government who are trying to design better research, and civil society. We have a very engaged South Africa, and these sorts of engagements, but harnessed around research and good information. I can't overstate how critical this has been over the last decade, which hasn't been a happy moment for very good government officials trying to design really good policies, or for the rest of us in trying to build a better South Africa. And so SA Tide is really a very well thought through intervention into that space that tries to bring these parties together, focus on some key areas, build younger scholars, but work also with people in the departments. And, given this context, it's an anointed space, don't you agree? I mean, I don't want to, yeah. And so Econ 3x3 is partnering on this afternoon. Econ 3x3 is an independent online policy newsletter that arose out of a project like this that was trying to pull together all of these participants respectfully. People have a lot of good research and a lot of good ideas. Do I really sound like that? Please, no.
Might be AI.
Oh, boy. This technology that Professor Marwala was talking about. Let me continue anyway. It really does convene think pieces where people, policy researchers or university researchers or civil society bring their research, write it out very, very clearly and accessibly. What are they saying? What are its implications? And what are its contributions into contemporary policy debates? I'm sure you will agree that that resonates very, very nicely with the goals of SA Tide, and we've been working together and collaborating. And in a build-up to this afternoon's meeting, you will see that that Econ 3x3 has actually produced many some sustained think pieces around this issue already. And not to begin at the end, but once the engagement's over, the idea is that the engagement's not over. We will continue. The focus of our discussion today is really on this constellation between grants or support to the working age population and active labour market policies, whereas, as Professor Marwala said, the whole goal of support to the economically active population is to support them into productive employment on behalf of our country. And SA Tide has a lot to bring to the table this afternoon as well. There's been some important work in the design of COVID policies, COVID support policies for those falling out of the labour market. SA Tide did some really important work. And then in the evaluation of the impact of those policies, working with our other work stream, which is on public revenue generation or tax policy, looking at all of that, at the impacts, but also the costs of these policies, and very important in supporting the development and implementation of those policies through COVID. And then looking beyond, including training of Treasury officials to use the type of tools of policy analysis in their own work. At the same time, SA Tide has also made a contribution to the other side of this afternoon's discussion, to labour market policy. Perhaps the best collation of research around one of our biggest programs, the employment tax incentive in this country, comes out of SA Tide with our work stream, working together with the enterprise development, the firm work stream in the tax data, looking at how firms behave, looking at how firms respond to the employment tax incentive, looking at how firms are adjusting to COVID, looking at how they're adjusting to the fourth industrial revolution. And also doing some work on the temporary employment relief scheme, which was one of the COVID policies, but targeted at firms. And we were able to do some really good work in that area. We've done some work about the distribution, spatial distribution of employment, uniquely using tax data and building these resources for the South African research community. So we've got material to bring into these engagements, and we're proud to do that. But that's not the point of the engagement, is to advertise our research. It's to bring our research together with a lot of the other researchers who are working in this area around the country. As I said, Econ 3x3 has been featuring articles both from SA Tide work, but also from a very broad range of inputs around the country. There's a lot of research to bring to bear to this very issue. And our panel brings a lot with them. That's the little warm you up and make you look forward to our panel. They bring a great deal. They're very prominent in this discussion in South Africa. We're not the only voices, and we don't think that we are. We're a diverse set of voices, and this is just the start rather than the end. So it's the art of the possible, and we've worked quite hard at this historically, and this afternoon I'm convening this gathering almost in a sort of like a minister in a church service. We come together this afternoon to explore the art of the possible, really, in crafting some well-designed and affordable, as Professor Marwala was saying, and maximally impactful policies that are at the intersection of support to the unemployed and active labour market policies. In a sense, the unemployed in this country deserve nothing less than for us to bring our best. So no pressure, panel. But thank you so much, and thank you all.
I guess I should be saying amen, Pastor Murray. It seems we are replete with the biblical references this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Ayabonga Tawe. I'm from the International Trade Administration Commission, and I'll be the moderator for the discussion this afternoon. I guess the choice, Mari, of me as a moderator was also, I guess, to assist me to maybe suspend some of my own views in relation to the discussion today. So I'll try and certainly sneak some of those in where appropriate. But I would like to say, just before I introduce my panelists this afternoon, maybe just make some brief reflections so that we can really, I guess, contextualize where we are. I don't think anybody needs any introduction to the scale of the problem in South Africa. Everybody knows the nature of the unemployment we have. And often people make reference, there's a page towards the end of the Economist magazine that has a list of a selected sample of countries across the world, and on a few measures. So they look at the exchange rate, they look at unemployment, they look at where CPI is. And the one stark and startling, I guess, variable there, certainly for us, is always around the unemployment number. So when you look at it in relation to other countries in the world, you begin to understand that we're not just an outlier, but I guess a particularly turbulent one at that. So that's the context. But also, the kind of unemployment we have in South Africa is not just frictional. And I think, as many colleagues are going to share, it is fundamentally structural. It's characterized by deep levels of discouragement, where people end up opting out of the job search. It also is one where we certainly don't have, compared to many other countries in the global south, the capability of the informal sector to really absorb many of those who are displaced from formal sector employment. So that mop-up doesn't happen. But we also do see in many sectors that it's still a labor market defined by significantly imperfect mobility of labor. So you lose a job in an industrial firm somewhere, it's highly unlikely that you're going to find a similar role in a similar kind of manufacturing. In all likelihood, you probably are to be found in the ranks of the unemployed and maybe, as a recipient of a social grant. Now, this is the context that we find ourselves in. But also, it's a context where, over the last few decades, a series of policy measures have been introduced. And my colleagues will be saying a lot more about active labor market policies, how those have evolved, but also how the introduction, in the COVID-19 moment, of the Social Relief of Distress Grant and other measures aimed at reaching firms, work seekers, and of course also at a policy level, institutional interface, how all of those have unfolded. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the questions of complementarity. So are all of these measures pulling in the same direction? Are all of these measures singing from the same hymn sheet? Marie, if I can use that biblical reference again. But also, what are the implications for poverty and inequality? What are the implications for our macro-fiscal situation? What are the trade-offs? So we're going to talk about that. We also, I hope, are going to talk about design and sequencing questions. What do we do first? What follows that? What are we learning in the process about how we've designed these policy measures and policy instruments? But more importantly, I do think that the point that Professor Marwala is raising around the future of work and the implication of technological change on specific work processes, especially in relation to those with limited or no skill in their participation in the labor market, I certainly hope is something we can talk about. It's quite interesting, towards the end of last year at a UNU-WIDER session in Bogota, the economist Darren Acemoglu spoke about how all of the technological change historically has not always solely been associated with the displacement of certain tasks, but in many instances, the task composition of work has also introduced new tasks. And so we would want to see to what degree that has implications on work as we understand it. So those are just some opening reflections as we start. And maybe at this stage, let me introduce my panelists, and I'll start on my far right. Certainly by no means on the far right of the political spectrum, I can tell you that. Dr. Kate Phillip is certainly known to many in the room. She is the program lead of the Presidential employment stimulus here in South Africa. She has certainly been instrumental in the design of one of the programs we have, public employment programs in South Africa, the Community Works Program, a very critical program. And she's also the author of Markets on the Margins, Mine Workers, Enterprise Development and Job Creation. Next to Dr. Philip is Professor Michael Sachs. He's an adjunct professor at SCIS, the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. He's also with the School of Economics and Finance at WITS, and he's also the former head of the Budget Office at the National Treasury, and is involved in the Public Economy Project at WITS University. He's also the deputy chair of the Fiscal and Financial Commission. Next to him is Dr. Thabi Leoka. She is an economist with a consulting and advisory company, Naha Investments. She's a member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. She also sits on the Council of Stats SA, where she chairs the Economic Committee, and has a long history as an economist in the financial and capital markets, and she's joining us today as well. Next to Dr. Leoka is Sibusiso Kumbi, who is the Director for Macroeconomic Policy at the National Treasury, where much of his work certainly looks at much of what we're going to discuss today, questions of household vulnerability, the impact of many policy measures across the state on poverty, inequality, employment and transformation, and certainly somebody who has also had significant interface with social partners in many stakeholder fora, including NEDLAC. Next to Sibusiso is Professor Haroon Borat. He's a professor of economics at the University of Cape Town and with the Development Policy Research Unit, DPRU. He also sits on the Presidential Economic Advisory Council and certainly one of the most well-known and long-standing economists working on labor market questions in South Africa. Certainly, I guess, as we think through a lot of this, it's also somebody who spoke about, civil society earlier on. And we're also joined today by Amanda Rinquest next to me, on my right. Well, actually, yeah, it's my far left, isn't it? So at least it applies to you, yeah. So she's a program manager at Black Sash, and if you know anything about South Africa and its history, you would certainly know the great agitational and advocacy work done historically and in the contemporary environment by Black Sash, and in particular on this question of social transfers in recent memory, on questions of institutional and policy design in that particular space, and we certainly look forward to hearing a lot more from Black Sash this afternoon in relation to some of the things that we're talking about. So let me maybe start off with you, Dr. Philip. How we're going to do it is we're going to get some opening remarks. All of my panelists are going to have 2 minutes to just share some reflections based on the scene-setting remarks we've received from all of us. And then thereafter we'll have a discussion, and we don't want this to be a spectator sport. So all of us, I guess, will have an opportunity, ample opportunity, to make our contributions today. And I certainly look forward to some of the reflections also in the audience. So please make note of those comments, and when we do get the opportunity to open it up to the room, you'll all have a chance to make your inputs. So Dr. Philip, let me start off with you. You have 2 minutes to maybe just share some of your own reflections on this question we're discussing today, and I guess, how we get more people of working age who don't have work, in some cases have never worked, into work, and how do we make sure that all of the instruments and tools we have are singing off the same hymn sheet?
Sure. Thank you. I think the first point I want to emphasize is that in the way that we approach this, the debate so often descends, I would say, into a set of binary choices. It's about grants or it's about instruments like public employment. And a key message here is that the starting point for any society has to be to address hunger. It has to be the starting point. But our development vision cannot stop there, because work matters and participation in work matters. It's foundational on all kinds of levels for social functioning, but also for productivity in private markets, in the informal sector, in any form of economic activity you care to name. So it matters that we enable people to participate in employment. But we face these structural challenges. I'm happy to talk to them, but let's take them as read. We face real structural challenges to growth, quite apart from the current contextual ones. And that means there is a really strong case in our context for some level of social provision of employment. In the same way that we accept that things like health, education, public transport should not be left to markets alone, employment should not be left to markets alone. That's the case for a strong policy component focused on public employment, and it's about identifying instruments that can unlock the social value of labor. So much of our labor market discussion assumes that if labor has no market value, it has no value. And that is the message we give to people who are unemployed, that they have no value. However, labor has social value and can create all kinds of societal value, even when it has no market value. What we need are instruments to unlock that value. We have plenty of experience with that in South Africa. In the presidential employment stimulus, we have built on a long track record in this space with the expanded public works program. We've shown that we can go to greater levels of scale with fabulous work experience, high quality social value creation, and that's the case I'll be making today. Thanks, Ayabonga.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philip. Professor Sachs, let me hand over to you. You seem quite shocked. Do people never call you Professor Sachs?
I usually tell people that an adjunct professor is not far from a junk professor. So I don't insist on it. So I suppose I would agree with Kate that often these debates get reduced to binaries, and one of the binaries that frequently arise in the South African debate, and I think Professor Marwala was almost pointing towards that kind of binary, is between a development state and a welfare state. So I think that given the kind of developments in work that Professor spoke about and you spoke about, one of the elements is that technology might develop new tasks, but another element might be that what makes us human becomes more important in the world of work, because those are the things that machines can't do. And one of the things that makes us human is empathy with other humans. So any work activities that involve such empathy may get privileged in this new labor market. And those are the work activities that are most often associated with what I would prefer to call the social state rather than the welfare state. And so if we want a path of development in South Africa, where so much of our history has been about eroding human capital, if we want a path of development, the idea that that should be a path centered on investment in human beings, I think is a very compelling case in South Africa. And then you break down this dichotomy between a welfare developmental state and a social state. The problem we have now is that one of the most important pillars of the social state as it developed, say, in Europe, has been active labor market policies and public employment strategies and support through grants for unemployed workers. And we're seeing an expansion of those elements of the social state in South Africa today. Unfortunately, it is coinciding with a contraction and collapse of very many other important elements of the social state. And I think what that forces us to ask is, how do we see this state developing? Do we see it? We need to make that debate explicit, because it's kind of developing in a way that is not planned, where we seem to be moving towards more informal modes of employment within the public sector. at the same time that we are contracting the formal employment in the sector. So I'll give you an example. Gauteng has just employed 6,000 crime wardens. Next year's budget, if you're going to come in on budget, you're going to have to cut the police force by 8,000 heads. So I don't think they're going to cut the budget, the police force, by 8,000 heads. But that's where the pressure is pushing us. So does it mean we're moving towards a state that employs more crime wardens and fewer police officers? Is that the choice we're making by default, or are we making it explicitly? And so I think, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, you make a very interesting point, because it's not just in the law enforcement space. I mean, you see this deepening of atypical and informal forms of work, community health workers, you see it in the debates around equalization of wages around the EPWP, and maybe we can come back to that, Dr. Philip. But let me hand over to you, Dr. Tabi, for some of your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you. And I absolutely agree with Dr. Phillips on this whole binary, that the debate is actually has been quite divisive rather than constructive. And it's really not about whether we should have it or not. And my issue with this topic is that, I'll start from the top. I think the failure to deliver a better life for all is what has got us here to talking about this very discussion. And had we done what we needed to do for the past 30 years, I think the structural problems that you also alluded to earlier would not be the big burden that is quite prevalent now, that is burdening the system and ensuring that labor absorption is so difficult. We've spoken about oligopolies and monopolies for decades. And we've also heard promises of how these will be dismantled over some time to allow for competition, to allow for smaller players. And we haven't seen that in 30 years, just as an example. And then recently, the National Treasury put together a document that looks at reforms and the little reforms that we need to do. It wasn't an NDP type of document. It was a document that actually highlighted the small changes that we need to do in the economy in order for us to absorb labor, change the structure of the economy, emphasize on network industries that would generate economic growth and employment. And we still haven't seen that happening. And I'd actually argue that since the document was published, we've actually regressed. If you look at our railway system, for instance, if you look at how the transportation, and not just railway in terms of Transnet, but also, not freight, but also passenger rail, which again, as we know, we've seen examples in the Western Cape, huge enabler of growth, cuts costs to those looking for work. But these are the things that we still haven't done. So reforms for me are really crucial. The building work we need to do, the foundational work in order for us to get where we need to be, or else we'll find ourselves in 20 years' time discussing the same topics on how we need to break the system down and how are we going to then absorb this labor that is a problem. And not just an economic problem, it's a social problem as well. So there's certain things that, I sympathize with National Treasury. I look at the budget quite closely, and being a macroeconomist, issues like austerity measures and topics around austerity measures frustrate me, because if you look at what austerity is, it's not what we've done. What we've done, I'd argue, is the misallocation of resources. If you compare, so South Africa in 2008, the national debt was very similar to Eskom's debt at its worst, so around 500 billion, more or less. This is 2008. Today, we're talking what? 4.7 trillion. And I ask South Africans, how come you haven't asked your government, what have you done with all this money? Where is it in the system? Where is it in the economy? What has it built? How can you account for all that money? And then in year 2025-26, that amount goes up to 6 trillion. So there's a lot of money in the system. It's just being misallocated, and that's why the austerity thing doesn't frustrates me, because it's really just where we've stolen money from or we've taken money from and how we've utilized it. That is, I think, one of the main issues about the allocation of resources.
So let's pause there just for a second, Tabitha, because I see you've got a long list there, so I don't want you to exhaust your list.
Okay.
But I think we get the areas you want to cover, and I certainly want to come back to the allocative point you're making, because I do think it's quite important. If you look at some of the big capital spenders in the South African economy, our state-owned companies and some of our municipalities, 2017-18, some of our metros on capex were spending much more than what they're spending at the moment. Underspend in many of our state-owned companies on capital budgets, I think, is also a cause for great concern, because it does signal, many people have often spoken of an investment strike on the part of the private sector, but I think some of the numbers are nudging us in a direction where we can have some cause for concern about the investment spending in the public sector, and especially on network industries. And we'll come back to that, Dr. Leoka. Spusiso? I saw you as Dr. Leoka was speaking, a lot of it resonating, expectedly so, because I guess Dr. Leoka said she certainly has a lot of sympathy for you folks at the National Treasury. Your opening remarks.
Thanks, Ayabonga. I think there are very important things that have been said by the panelists so long. Unfortunately, I'm going to lean on the stereotype of the National Treasury bean counter and throw some figures at everyone. But I promise you the majority of my submissions today is not about figures and numbers.
At least you didn't bring slides.
Yes, I didn't bring slides. And one of the roles that I've been fortunate to go into in the last year or so is I'm serving as the policy co-lead of the work stream that Professor Murray Liebrandt is leaning towards. So maybe some of the academia has rubbed off on me. Professor Chilidzi was saying earlier about how maybe there should be sabbaticals, and please don't exclude academia in there, please, Prof. So a couple of numbers I think are important to keep in mind, just to really speak to South Africa's very unique circumstances. So we have, under the strict definition, the most narrow definition, 8 million people unemployed, just under 8 million people. 2 million of those people are people who have lost their jobs, who are in employment, have subsequently left employment for a number of reasons, and that's not an insignificant number. However, nearly 4 million people are new entrants and re-entrants to the labor force that have never been able to interact with work, either formal or informal. That's something that contributes to what we understand as the structural nature of our unemployment, but it's such a uniquely South African thing in many ways. I'll give you another example. So since we started releasing statistics on a quarterly basis in terms of employment, the quarterly labor force says that we've added 1.8 million jobs since the quarterly labor force started in 2008. Again, not an insignificant number. One has to contrast that or contextualize that with the fact that the labor force, the people who are of working age who have made themselves available to work, has grown by 5.3 million. That's nearly 3 times the number of jobs that have been created. And again, this reinforces the challenge that we're facing in that South Africa, the structural unemployment challenge is really about these new entrants, or re-entrants rather, but yeah, basically new people that are interfacing with the labor market. And that's something that we need to think about when we're thinking about interventions to support job growth, to fundamentally move the needle and change the unemployment landscape. We really need to start taking these unique characteristics of South Africa into account. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Spusiso. And I think it's quite helpful because, in a way, whatever employment growth we have effectively means we're chasing our tail. That, in a way, it isn't large enough, the number of roles that are created to be able to deal with this growth in the working age population. And that's certainly something that I think we might just want to keep in mind. Professor Borat, let me hand over to you for your opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks very much. I had to put my timer on because I see our chair is managing us carefully. I'm actually quite happy because this is now turning into a very moderate, careful discussion that's not are you for the SRD or against the SRD? So my
Fire and brimstone is still coming.
so all my PowerPoint slides are out of the window, which is actually great. So I thought let me just pick up on what Kate said at the outset, which is the binary choices. Yes, I agree. I think, though, that if we are going to have the nuanced discussion, it has to be about the weight of policy choices. So in other words, are we thinking carefully about employment generation, welfare provisioning in terms of every rand of fiscal spend that we have available? Are we allocating across welfare provisioning, employment support appropriately? So let me lead with that into the following observation, that if you looked at how we thought about policy provisioning since '94, we did all the right things in terms of assets and services to the poor, education, health, social services generally, in terms of the allocation. We can talk about quality and reach and the second order stuff later on, but the initial electrification, water provisioning, the initial allocation was correct on the asset side. We then thought of poverty alleviation and indirectly employment generation as being the touchstone for, or rather the entry point for that being the household. And so what we did was we ramped up social grants. Not necessarily as a bad thing, but essentially the logic of the policymaker was the way in which you deal with welfare provisioning and income, right? Provisioning and income growth is through the household via social grants. And so we become one of the most effective states in the world in terms of targeting and reaching the poor through social assistance. What we've done, though, right, is to now use that instrument, and that's the SRD debate, as the only instrument available to generate employment and to reduce poverty and to do the good things, reduce poverty and inequality. So I want to ask the question, have we, and I'm going to put it up as a debate, have we not thought appropriately, creatively enough about firms? I don't mean listed entities. I mean one-person informal sector operators, micro-enterprises, the support base for employment generation in a sustainable form. We heard the rector saying it, right? And the rector's not even an economist and he gets it, right? That we haven't thought about the entry point as being firms and the support that needs to come from government towards firms. I'm going to end off with the following observation.
I see you've taken 40 seconds extra, only because I barred you from presenting slides. You can
Okay.
take the next 20 seconds.
The output employment elasticity for South Africa is about 0.7. Output employment elasticity looks exactly the same as most middle-income countries. I'm looking at our international observers. I want you to write, if you don't mind, 3 figures down. 45, 45, 10. That's the ratio of wage employed to the informally employed to the unemployed in middle-income countries. That's the average middle-income country. 45, 45, 10. Yeah? What is South Africa's first figure of wage employed? 50. 50. The second number is your problem. It's not 45. It's 16, and the last number is 34. So I want to leave that observation that actually the problem of open unemployment is not a wage employment problem, it's an informal sector issue, and we can debate that.
Thank you very much, Professor Borat, and I think, yeah, touches on this issue of not just the ability to mop up unemployment in the formal sector or the informal sector, but its ability to survive and its own vitality. And I think these are some of contemporary and historic questions that we probably have to deal with. Amanda, let me hand over to you to make some of your opening remarks.
I must start off by saying I'm not an economist, so numbers don't matter to me. I'll speak if 2 minutes. But I am an attorney, and so our holy book, if we're going to keep with this very religious theme today, is that our holy book is the Constitution. And from that point of view that we look at this policy debate. And Black Sash is very much grounded in the idea of Section 27 of the Constitution, which is where we must start this discussion. And the Constitution is the cornerstone which says every single person who is unable to provide for themselves must be given some form of social assistance, and that can, I mean, some sort of social security, and that can be in the form of social assistance. And so the Black Sash argues, and has argued for several years now, that there needs to be a form of grant in hand, cash in hand, basic income for those aged 18 to 59, and whether they are job seekers or not. And that is to alleviate immediate poverty, and that's the starting point, is that before we have big questions of affordability, we have questions of hunger, and we have a fundamental text which says that those who cannot provide food for themselves must receive social assistance from the state. And so for the past several years, and especially during COVID, Black Sash has called for this implementation of a grant, and we've kind of worked on some level of like how we can fund it and what it should be, and the idea that the strong belief is that at its minimum it should be, I mean, what we would prefer is for it to be at the upper bound food poverty line, which I think is 1,400 Rand in South Africa right now. But at the minimum, it needs to be at the lower bound poverty line, food poverty line, which is about 660. And that the state should work for the universality of this. And again, we don't want any binaries. And so Black Sash has always also called for the idea of basic income grant forming part of a social protection floor. And that social protection floor must include jobs. It must include a functioning public transport system for the poor and for the wealthy. It must include school meals. It must include an NHI. It must have all this basket of rights. And so the basket, it can't be the binary of jobs and grants. The basket is all of the things that make sure that people have a dignified life in South Africa. And I think I'm very glad you mentioned the issue of trains, because I think we don't always realize just how much public transport is a form of justice and a form of dignity. And so I don't know if I've used my 2 minutes, but I just wanted to start off by saying that for us, the policy debate starts with the Constitution.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Amanda. And yeah, you were quite close to using the 2 minutes. So nearly there. No, it's fine. So I do want us to start, colleagues, where the debate started, around this binary choice. Because, Haroon says something quite interesting. He says, we need to think about the balance and the weighting. And Haroon, I'm going to start off with you. Don't all of these measures in some shape or form land up at the firm? And the reason why I ask is, in July last year, one of the big retailers, Mr. Price, puts out a SENS announcement. And the first thing they say in the SENS announcement is, the delay in the social relief of distress grant and the increase in the other grants in a way that they felt didn't catch up with the cost of living, population growth, and yada yada, has effectively meant that their sales growth targets were out of kilter. So effectively, some of the firms, many of them large listed and some even smaller, are already starting to plan around this as a demand injection. So is it okay for us to draw this distinction between measures that affect the work seeker versus those that affect the household versus those that target the firm?
Yes, in many ways, I see that as a really good example of why you wouldn't want an SRD, right? Because all it does is it reinforces a consumption-driven growth model, right? So you've got a demand-led growth trajectory, whereas if it was a constrained, for the next 1 Rand you have available in terms of fiscal support, would you put it into the SRD if it does that, right? Or would you take it to, in fact, as a good supply-side measure, either improve work readiness or, in fact, provide provisioning to the informal sector so we can move up that 16% right up to the middle income country average, I would say the more sustainable route, right, would be the latter. And I think for me, that's where the nuance comes in, right? So yes, I think Kate's right. We don't want binary choices, but in fact, you may be forced into making the binary, right? So poor old Sibu here is going to sit and say, okay, are we going to go for the SRD? And if that's the case in a constrained fiscal environment, where does that take us with other grants? And then you are in a sort of, you are making binaries, right? Choices because of the constrained fiscal envelope. Okay. And so for me, I think we don't need to debate the SRD as much as say, well, if you are going to go down the route of a particular policy path, you've effectively made choices and you better get the weighting correct.
Okay. Tabi?
You know, I'm so glad you mentioned firms in this context, because when many firms were concerned about COVID, and I presented to many of the fast-moving consumer goods retailers that we have in South Africa. And I said to them, don't worry, they were very anxious about COVID, affordability, etc. I said, no, the way I'm seeing it, actually, you are the winning guys in this whole, in this whole crisis. Because suddenly the people who actually got an increase are not the employed, are the ones who received social grants, and also the top up in terms of the SDR. And many were skeptical. And you know what? Look at the share price in the past 2 years, not this year, of retailers, consumer retailers on the JSE, and how well they've done in the past years. To the extent that many of them actually started, the trend started a little before COVID, but you got your ShopRites going into townships in USAVE, your Pick n Pay's doing the same, because that was a captive market. And then it goes back to the discussion at hand. The trade-offs, who's benefiting, what are we creating with the SDRs? And we just need to be careful in terms of the imbalances in the economy that we're creating.
Sure. So Tabi, I mean, just a layman's thought would say that if a clothing and textile or food and beverage retailer gets more of its inventory moving, and enough of that inventory is produced here locally, that you're likely to get some indirect or direct job impacts of that. What would your thoughts be on that? And I'll bring you in on this one as well, Dr. Phillip.
So the unemployment numbers don't tell me that. They tell me that actually companies were shedding jobs whilst making a profit. And then it also goes to who owns these entities, and not just who owns them who's the CEO, who owns them from a share price, who are the shareholders of these entities. Those are people who benefit, not the majority of South Africans who are consumers. And so it also goes back to what I said in my introduction in terms of oligopolies. If those who owned the means of production were the ones who were consuming and then encouraging this whole circular economy, then we would be talking, be having a different conversation.
Okay, Dr. Phillip? Yeah, market structure issues mean that I guess a lot of this sort of demand boon is distributed upwards rather than, I guess, filtering into expenditure locally and hopefully some into informal trade. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is an area where we really need a lot more work, but intuitively and based on some of the research, I mean, a lot of that, the SRD grant is spent mostly locally. If you're talking about the informal sector, it was a significant boost to the informal sector. We have seen evidence of a different spending pattern for those who are getting wages through public employment programs, for example, where it's a much wider basket of goods, and so the stimulus effect in the economy is wider. But on the structural issues, I really want to pick up on the informal sector discussion, because I think it's so important to understand what does make us exceptional in South Africa. I mean, if you look at the composition of the informal sector in comparable countries, over 50% of that comes from agriculture and subsistence agriculture. And in South Africa, the reason we don't have that is because of land dispossession. You can actually account for most of the difference in the scale of our informal sector and other developing countries and middle-income countries because of that one fact, land dispossession. The other thing is that we have a history of a very formal proletarianization. So, for example, other equivalent countries, domestic workers are informal. In South Africa, we had pass laws. You couldn't be a domestic worker or work in a garden or do any of those forms of work without a contract and a pass. So we've got formalization baked into our labor markets. And it means that the informal sector is not therefore just a simple solution and a failure. South Africans aren't entrepreneurial. That's what the problem is. It's red tape. It's all of those kinds of things. Yeah, sure, there's some things to sort out there. But I think we need to fundamentally understand that the structure of our labor market is completely different from other comparable countries. There's no rolling back the land dispossession issue. You can't put everyone now urbanized back on the land and solve that problem. We're going to have to find our own path. We're going to have to find different solutions.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Philip, because I guess in a way it does raise, some of these political economy questions arising from the history we come from. I spoke earlier on about imperfect labor mobility, but there's also then, of course, this question of informality, Michael, not just in the kind of work that is now happening in the state, but even planning informality on the margins of our cities. Rural economies and the decimation of those rural economies is creating a very particular dynamic. Just your thoughts on what this discussion does in introducing trade-offs in the public budgeting process. Because we're often told, you don't get your pie and eat it. You kind of have to balance at times, competing set of considerations and make your choices. Your own assessment of how those choices have been made in our budgeting process and to what degree that has contributed to us dealing with some of the things we need to deal with.
Okay, but first let me say something about the informal sector, which I just wanted to add to what Kate was saying, which I agree with wholeheartedly, which is that many of the other countries that have maybe a more normal distribution of the informal sector and therefore absorb the employment into rural subsistence agriculture, it's not as though the people in that rural subsistence agriculture are having a great time of it. In fact, in many cases, they're much poorer than the unemployed in South Africa if those unemployed are located in particular places. So you have mass immiseration, but it happens to take the form of on a farm in a rural area, and I don't think we should see that as the solution to our problem. And it relates very much to two things I want to disagree with Haroon and Kate on. Is Haroon said we did everything right in as far as distributing assets to people is concerned. I think that's fundamentally wrong. We gave people a minimum level of consumption of electricity and water where they lived, but we have done almost nothing to address the structure of wealth inequality in South Africa. Instead, the budget has probably gone as far as it can in redistributing income. I agree, we can't undo the land dispossession, but we can do a lot better than what we've done so far, that's for sure. We can't undo the legacy of apartheid education, but we can do much better than we've done so far. So when we think about assets, and lastly, and probably the most important one is the one you raise, Aya, which is about access to urban livelihoods. Look at the place where we are. Can an informal worker who wants to sell a magwinya come within 5 kilometers of where we're sitting? They cannot. You need a car to get here, right? And so we need to ask how we begin to break down those structures of exclusion that are fundamentally about access to assets. So in terms of the public budget, I disagree wholeheartedly with Tabi, that the budget is allocated as you would expect it to be in broad terms. It's allocated to the social imperatives that are set out in the Constitution: education, healthcare, social protection, and other things that are important like criminal justice. That's where the vast bulk of resources is going. What we're having now, unfortunately, in public budgeting is that, and maybe it goes back to this point of immiseration in the informal sector. The important thing is that incomes rise and that the national income rises. And if the national income is falling, as it is in South Africa, as it has been for the last decade in per capita terms, you're going to get a continuous fiscal squeeze. And that's where we are. We're in a process of austerity, which is a kind of a fiscal impasse, which we cannot escape without a significant acceleration of growth. And it's in that context that we need to be very careful about reallocating resources to new ideas. Because in that context, it necessarily means shifting resources away from what is currently being funded. So I think Professor Marwala made a comment, oh no, it was somebody else actually, about funding for higher education. The large increase in funding for higher education that took place because of well-intentioned protests among students has contributed to an erosion of the basic education budget. And we need to be, when we evaluate policy, it's very important to look at not only the impact that a particular grant has in a particular township or a particular job has in a particular community, but we need to ask ourselves, how are we financing that? So the problem is not overconsumption. The problem is not overconsumption in South Africa. The problem of overconsumption in South Africa is a problem of the affluent elite. It's really hard to argue that increasing consumption opportunities for the poorest is a problematic development path when we all agree that they're living below a level of consumption that we find socially acceptable. So raising them up to that consumption level should be a no-brainer. What's not so easy is to render that sustainable, and the way you render it sustainable is by reducing the consumption of the affluent elite. And if we simply focus on the supply of projects, the supply of grants, the supply of employment programs through the state, but we don't address those fundamental distributional struggles that are taking place in the country, I think we won't achieve the objectives we want to.
I see Sbusiso's got his hand up, and also Haroon wants to respond on the informal one. But let me come to you, Amanda, first, and I'll come back to you, Sbusiso. The issue that Michael is raising around distributional questions, I think, is critical. You were mentioning earlier, the level setting in relation to the upper bound and lower bound food poverty line. But also all of the other measures, because, the NDP says a big part of our policy agenda is about lowering the cost drivers for poor households. So giving an entire package rather than just this labor market related one. Just your thoughts on how we've given effect or not to that constitutional promise that you were talking about, and whether or not the budget itself is the only or maybe the most adequate of tools to achieve that.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I definitely agree with what Michael said about not just looking at the assets and the supply and actually focusing on the quality. If you make a grant too small, you keep people in poverty. If you provide schools but that school infrastructure is inadequate, you keep students out of school, you keep them not learning. So we have to look at the substance of what we're providing. And the idea of, sorry Arun, but the idea of creating a consumer or benefiting the firms or creating this consumer society already exists. If we don't have a basic income support, if we don't have the SRD grant, it's still the retailers who benefit from the current grant system. It's still Time Bank that just made this new thing where you can get your child support grant in advance. If you've run out of money mid-month, they'll give you an advance because there are other guaranteed grants that have made it profitable for Pick and Pay, Boxer, Time. Whether that grant exists or not, and that's an issue of a failing state, but I don't think that's for today. We'll keep everyone here for much longer if we discuss Post Bank and the failing of the post office. But and now I've just lost your question. But the idea...
No. So let me restate it. So my question was, earlier on you had said the starting point for us has to be the Constitution. And I'm saying the Constitution makes provision for all of these things that if you take a life stage approach, should be kicking in at different stages in my life. Is the budget adequate as a tool? Because I guess that's what Michael was talking about, that these embedded distributional questions in the budgeting process. And are we looking too long at the budget where we should be looking maybe elsewhere?
So I have two responses to that. And the one is, again, what Michael said about rethinking wealth distribution in South Africa. I think if we do the same budget policy, we're going to get the same results. And I made this joke with Sibusiso earlier about the legacy of the 3 TMs, which is that in South Africa we have Treasury is the legacy of the 3 TMs. You had Trevor Manuel, who in 2001 said, we could never have a basic income grant of 100 Rand, it'll ruin the economy. You've got the next TM, Thabo Mbeki, who said, no, we could never have these social, who Thabo Mbeki's approach to budgeting was, economic trickle down. And then you've got the third TM, who just before he left also said this, that's Tito Mboweni, for those who didn't guess the third TM. 10 points for those who did.
Lucky star.
10 lucky star 10 for those who did guess the third TM. But he then said, that there's no social compact, there's no such thing as a grant must be increased. That's what he said for his budget speech. There's no such thing as a social compact that says grants must increase every year. So you've got the legacy of the 3 TMs, and those 3 kind of theories to economics is never going to get us that wealth redistribution that Michael that I must agree with must happen. So, sorry, my first answer to your question. So the one is that the budget in itself is not enough because there seems to be a philosophy and a thinking in the budget that doesn't focus on a human rights-based approach. That's my first response. My second is that, and I think it's probably related to my first, is that when we talk about wealth redistribution, when we talk about grant, when we talk about is the Constitution enough, it's that it doesn't seem to be the starting point. Doesn't seem to be, and not saying for this for the panel, but I'm saying for National Treasury, for South Africa generally, it isn't the starting point because that's just not the legacy in which we've focused, and understandably we've focused on those assets rather than rethinking the system. Sure.
Yeah, maybe Amanda, just at coffee outside, you might want to have a chat with Haroon about jobless growth during the Mbeki era. He has some ideas, I certainly know about that. But Sbusiso, let me bring you in, and then Haroon, I'll come back to you on the informality point. Sbusiso.
I'm going to be the consummate public servant and diplomat to say I agree with many of the points on both sides. But one lens that I think I wanted to introduce, the word trade-off has come up more than once, and I'm really encouraged by that because there's a context in which these decisions are being made. But the different lens I want to introduce in terms of a trade-off is the word accountability. And what I mean by that is, and we're speaking again around a constitutional duty, that the government, the civil service, is accountable to the electorate at the end of the day for every rand and cent. The SRD in the last sort of full year of its implementation, so the last SESA annual report that we are able to view at the moment says that when the SRD was introduced in August of 2001, up until March of 2022, 21, yes, August 21, into March 2022, they spent just over 32 billion rand on that. And just to contextualize that number, because I also feel sometimes, and this is something I speak with colleagues a lot, around how desensitized almost we've become to the notion of 1 billion rand, that if you had to spend, there's that maths statistic, if you had to spend R1 every second, it would take you 37 years to spend 1 billion rand. So 1 billion rand is a lot of money. Basically, what that means is 8% of the VAT intake for that year, or 10% of the entire corporate income tax take for that year, the equivalent of that was SRD, only the SRD. When you look at it in terms of spending line items, when you look at spending by classification, that was bigger than the line items for the entire sports, arts and culture department, the entire line item for courts, the entire line item for prisons, and nearly the entire line item for housing of that year. So when you come back to that, you really need to come back to think about considerations around value for money, because again, at the end of the day, government, National Treasury very directly, but government to a broad extent, are the custodians of public funds. There has to be discussions around value for money and what each rand gets us. I want to just introduce maybe a bit of a leading question to say, and maybe Prof. Sachs can correct me a little bit here, but just to say, unfortunately, in the last few years, raising additional public revenue has been somewhat difficult. It has not been very easy, or straightforward for that matter, I should say. So in 2018, the National Treasury, and I include myself as I'm not projecting outwards, National Treasury, along with wider government, introduced an increase in the VAT rate, which is the first in democratic South Africa. So it was not something that was done lightly. It was under very unique circumstances. So together with that VAT increase and a few other adjustments and a few other adjustments to taxes, that was intended to raise an additional 36 billion rand in tax. The outcome of that decision was that we actually collected 13 billion rand less revenue than was projected, and 1.1 billion less VAT than what was budgeted for, even with that increase, because of the economy. So we really need to also contextualize that, how easy it would be to amass additional resources. I'll end with a leading question I was going to say around the importance of something like SA Tide in providing the information, in providing the data for these conversations to be had, and for the idea of trade-offs to really have have a realistic fundamental conversation, because you can't have that conversation around trade-offs or accountability if you have very little information about what your programs are getting you, what bang for buck you're getting. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Suzanne. I think the point on VAT, maybe Tabi, I'm going to hand over to you after Haroon. You might want to weigh in, because you and I were part of the panel that was reviewing the food and non-food items to be zero rated. And at the time, I can certainly recall a lot of the contentious debate around that. Haroon, you've been sitting there quite quietly, and I know you've got some thoughts on informality and also jobless growth. So please go ahead.
So we didn't have jobless growth, just to be clear, statistically. But I wanted to just move on. So the informality point for Kate and for Michael holds for urban labor markets as well. So if you look at cross-country comparisons, we have a suppressed urban informal sector as well. I mean, in fact, Michael's point, right, emphasized that. For the international observers, why does South Africa look so strange? Go to every single city in the developing world. I always tell my students, right, look out the window at the university, at the parking lot, there's cars. There's no people selling you stuff. And I know Marty would love this, right? We've got a suppressed urban informal sector. Agriculture, separate issue, 1913, the destruction of the African peasantry, we know that. But let's not do away with the fact that that number in the middle of that ratio that I put to you is way too low. So you have to do something about providing points of entry for urban informality. And it is about, it's a supply-side economics of a good type, which is provide infrastructure for the informal sector, deregulate local municipalities so that they're not beating people out of the city and allowing them to. Now, why am I referring to that in the SRD debate? Because what are we trying to solve for? If you're trying to solve for employment and employment generation, the data and the analysis, I told Tabi, read the full paper. The long run, natural experiment, difference to difference analytics show zero impact on employment in the long run from an SRD. So it's not a labor market tool, right? So now we say consumption is a bad thing. I thought Michael would know this. It's consumption-driven versus investment-driven, right? That's what, we're making that choice, that's fine. But if we're after a consumption-based model, then it's not clear to me why. So what are you trying to solve for? Then you want to get people up to your poverty line. So why do you want to get a new grant? But why haven't we done the thought experiment which says, let's look at the child support grant, let's look at the old age pension, let's look at the SRD. It's a bit like what Sibu's boss told him, let's look at the family grant. So it's this idea of, well, if we recalibrate the entire social assistance scheme, what would be, within the fiscal envelope that they have available, what would be the most optimal grant to resolve a welfare problem? So make sure you know what you're solving for. Don't run around with an SRD and think you're going to solve employment. No.
Prof, just
That's
a quick one,
right.
follow up on that, on the consumption. Okay.
I have to tell Michael, the assets is a really important point, Michael, because what we did, and the empirics show that, is provision of physical assets. So electrification, water, housing. The data does show that as per the first two regimes, right? So both President Mandela and President Mbeki's periods show definitely an increase in the physical delivery.
You gave people physical houses, water and electricity in the veld far away from where the jobs are.
Yeah. No. My point is the asset poverty measure that we would generally use shows significant declines. Yes, there are problems now in terms of affordability and so on, but that's the second order challenge, if you like. But I just wanted
just a quick one on that, Haroon, on the consumption investment nexus. So are you suggesting that the signal, policy signal, that is a consumptive policy signal, doesn't influence the expectations that certain firms would have, and by extension, their investment decisions?
The point I was trying to get at is actually Sibu's numbers, right? So if I say to him, okay, no, you've got that X number of rands that you gave to the SRD. Can I have it, please? Because I'd like to give it to the informal sector on the supply side. Because I think what that will end up doing is drive an investment-driven growth trajectory. It's a very, right? So we never think of firm. That is my point about households versus firms, right?
Okay. No, I hear you, Prof.
Right.
So let me, wait. So Tabi, come in, and then I'll come to Michael, and then I'll finish off with you, Amanda. And then I'll come to everybody in the room. So please prepare your questions, jot them down, because, it's getting heated in here.
I just want to re-emphasize these numbers, Aya. 2018, the government debt, as in the South African debt, was 560 million. And going back to Sbu's point on the value of money and how we're so desensitized to big numbers, a billion. So that's 2008. Today, actually, let me say 2015, 2016, that number goes up to 6 trillion, just under 6 trillion. Even if you account for inflation, that is a ridiculous increase in debt. And I ask South Africans, please show me, where did your government spend that money? Because your GDP is less than that money. So when you say there's that austerity issue, there's a lot of money that's being spent in this country. It's just spent badly and in areas that don't generate growth. First point. Second point leads to the VAT and trade-offs. Because what happened, the reason why we ended up having that commission that myself, Ingrid, and Aya were involved in, together with, I think, 6 other economists, it was a very difficult exercise. But the reason why we were put together to actually solve the problem, which, by the way, when policymakers decided on the issue, they didn't realize that it was going to create this problem, is because we had fees must fall. And we capitulated as a state to say, okay, fine, because we don't have a solution for this, let's, knee-jerk reaction, introduce fee-free education. Then what happens? We can't afford it. Then they put a team together to then decide on which items were going to zero rate. And it was an excruciating exercise because we had so many, we had parameters too. We couldn't just decide to cut willy-nilly, because obviously, as Sbu said, that was the cost to the fiscus that we had to consider as a group. And so these are the things, again, in this country of knee-jerk reaction and trade-offs, and understanding what are we solving for. Because I think if you had to do a measurement today of, was it worthwhile, given just the cost of it, then I would like to, it would be an interesting outcome, even more interesting for me, because it's giving us, I think, what, 4 years since we did that? What was the outcome? So those who started first year on that free education, did they finish on time? And what is the quality of their education? And were they absorbed into the labor market? These are the exercises that I think we should do to show whether what we did was worthwhile. Lastly, just on the budget itself. And again, these are just, the budget is actually, our budget is the most redistributive budget of emerging markets. And within the expenditure, the social wage can be found in health, education, housing, social protection, transport, employment, etc. And that all amounts to about 1 trillion, or 60% of consolidated non-interest spending. But again, if it worked properly, I don't think we'd be here discussing this. So a lot of money goes into the social wage within our current budget, but that doesn't seep into the realities of South Africa. There's housing. To what extent has the allocation within the budget changed housing or health
Sorry,
or
just a quick one on
transport?
that. Do we have a counterfactual? So if we weren't spending as much on housing, and we know the backlog is there, or if we weren't spending as much on, say, connecting households to electricity via the in-app program, what all the other indicators would look like were it not for that?
A study needs to be done, but I think just, anecdotally, obviously it is having an impact, but is it the value, what Sbu said, value for money? Are we spending optimally? Is it impacting on the lives of South Africans? Should we be looking at each and every one of these programs and come back to the conclusion of, are we doing the right thing? Because if we're spending 1 trillion or 1.1 trillion on a social wage within our expenditure, again, just like the whole increase in our debt, where is it? Why can't we point to it? We talked about transport. Transport is a big recipient of this money. Health is a big recipient of this money, but count how many working efficiently public hospitals there are in the country.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that, Dr. Tabi. I mean, I remember a few years ago, a capital budget, I think, of one of the passenger rail entities had gone like a few billion had gone unspent. So it goes back, I guess, to some of these questions we're talking about. Michael, and then I'll come to you, Amanda, and then we'll take some questions from our audience here.
So I wanted to re-engage with the consumption investment debate, and also, Aya, your points about social grants playing into the bottom line of retail firms. So we did some work as part of the DSD panel with Mari and Margaret Chitugu on that we did for social development. She in particular did some general equilibrium modeling work. And the broad take-home, she knows it better than me, but the broad take-home in my interpretation is that, so what the general equilibrium can tell us is how would this grant change the kind of sectoral composition of economic activities in the economy? And the answer is not that surprising. It's that you're going to have more retail, you're going to have more alcohol, you're going to have more spending on transport, you're going to have more spending on the things that poor people tend to spend on, right? Going to supermarkets and stuff. And that is certainly not a path that is going to ignite a macroeconomic process of growth and development. Absolutely. Where I was disagreeing with you, Haroon, is saying, okay, but let's not use that argument to then say a redistribution of consumption opportunities is off the cards. Because actually, when you redistribute consumption activities, not only do you change the structure in that kind of static sense, but you have all of the kinds of effects that Kate is talking about, of people have an endowment that they can then use to invest in all kinds of things. And the fact that they're relieved from that below human consumption level, and are able to come up to a consumption level where there is less hunger is actually a pretty good thing, both from an economic development point of view and a redistribution. The problem is, if you do that and you finance it with debt, you are going to raise interest rates across the economy. And then there's going to be an offsetting impact that makes things even worse. So the way, if we want to do that path, what we need to be able to do is contain the consumption of the affluent. And I would suggest probably the best way to contain the consumption of the affluent is to raise VAT. And I say that because VAT, although the incidence of VAT falls on the more middle strata quite strongly, but when you think of consumption in South Africa, that big C that we read in macroeconomics, always remember that that reflects the distribution of income. So 80% of C is in the top 20% of the population. So redistributing consumption, I don't think we should rule that out of bounds as long as it's properly financed.
Sure. Okay. So, Amanda, I think you can also see here, I'm under siege here. So I don't know if you want to maybe, keep the question there or the comment that you wanted to make. And then you can maybe just squeeze it in some of the remarks that we're going to get now. So I'm quite keen to, is that fine? That's fine. Yeah. Okay. So let me maybe move to this microphone. So, okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to take 4 questions per round. I'm going to start on the left side of the room because I saw the hands shooting up. Please tell us your name, the organization you come from. Please be brief. Keep it to 1 question or comment. If you go beyond that, I will stop you. So let me just put that out. I don't know how you turn it on, man. Yeah. I don't know. Okay, so we're starting on the left, sorry, and we'll come back. I'll note the hands. So can I see the hands again? Let me start there with Wazim, sitting at the back of the class. Number 1, okay, number 2, number 3, number 4, okay? So you all have your numbers, okay? Number 1.
Thanks, Ayabonga, and thanks for the debate as well. So I just have one question around taxes, right? We spoke about redistribution of wealth, right? And some would argue South Africa already has wealth taxes, capital gains, estate duty, more recently dividends tax as well. Yeah? Is there any room left to raise taxes? I heard the debate about VAT, to finance social needs in the country. And if so, where is it? But also, how do we do it without continuing exodus of skills from the economy? Because we already face an exodus of skilled workers, of business people, and in a global environment, it's much easier to shift assets and wealth than it was before, Okay. So is there any room for that? And if so, where can we find it?
Okay. Thanks for that, Wazim. I guess Wazim saying those who are more moneyed are much more mobile. Number 2.
Hello, Heinrich Bollmann, University of Pretoria. It seems like a lot of the policy making we are trying to do is working around a big elephant in the room, the big corruption problem in South Africa. And I'm wondering, as a fellow computable general equilibrium modeler, to what extent do we often find that we're trying to move around policies and change policies, but it doesn't necessarily address the reason things are going wrong, right? So Michael is, for example, saying, all right, perhaps we need to tax the rich a bit more. We're already taxing the rich a lot. Is there space for more? Maybe it wouldn't have been necessary if a lot of our policies had the chance to function as designed, right? There's a lot of redistributive policies trying to help businesses, big money coming from government side, as Tabi has said. I think a big reason, the elephant in the room, we're not seeing the results is the big corruption problem. So my comment to go out there is to what extent do we often end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? Is the policies we are making the problem? Or is the environment in which they're trying to be implemented or often not even implemented at all the problem?
Okay, thanks, Heinrich. Number 3.
Good afternoon. My name is Mohammed Lokat. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. The question I'd like to ask is a bit of a controversial one, and something that I think is the actual elephant in the room. Something that I think we've skirted around, especially on the policy aspect of it and the research aspect of it. And it's that of illegal and untrammeled immigration. So we can't talk about unemployment and what was mentioned by the panel, the informal sector, the decimation of rural and urban economies, without talking about illegal immigration. And the point is that this research hasn't been done in the public sector, especially through UNU-WIDER or SA Tide or whatever it is. Why are we shying away from such research? And I think we're all aware of the scale of the problem, anecdotally and so on. We've seen the uprisings, we've seen the social unrest. When we go to a restaurant, we see the reality. When we get Uber Eats delivered, we see the reality. Where's the points of entry for South African citizens, is my question. Where's the research showing that this is an issue? And yeah, why are we shying away from such controversial questions? That's my question. Thanks.
Thanks, Mohammed, for that question. Do you have a number 4 here? I would probably layer another question on Mohammed's question, which is, do we see a revealed preference on the part of employers to employ those who are desperate and willing to work for any wage? But yeah, that's just my hijacking of your question. Thanks, Mohammed.
Yeah, Steve Goff from the University of Pretoria. So this has all been quite interesting, and I'm tempted to sort of fight elephant sizes here, but you know, government has sort of 3-4 levers to operate, right? One is taxes, the other is subsidies, right, which we think of as budget, and the other is a bit softer, right? It's regulations and it's actual competent behavior. And we don't have a very good idea of, I think, sort of the regulation side of things. Harun says that the wage sector is really quite large already, but there's clearly lots of regulation problems surrounding the entire labor market. Cut off because I speak too long. But I guess I'd like to try to get a handle on what we think is stopping the informal sector from growing in some of these urban and rural areas, even weekly. Right?
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I think maybe what I'd want to do, so I hope colleagues be jotting down the questions, because what I want to do, I want to go to the right-hand side of the room and take another 4, and then we'll get some responses. Online question coming from Lee Shala, I don't know how to pronounce that. If the social relief of distress grant or the big grant beneficiaries are likely spending grants on essentials, given South Africa's big problems with malnutrition, for example, is an increase in consumption-driven growth really such a bad thing? So yeah, I guess that's part of the questions we're asking. So let me start at the, sorry, yeah. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll come back, colleagues. So 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thank you.
Sorry, okay, wait. 1, please get the hands up, this cohort here, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll come back to you, ma'am, on this side, yeah?
I'm Elvis Kanyov from the Jobs Fund, GTech National Treasury. I'm drawing your attention on the title of what we are here for. And I would also want to please draw your attention to the opening remarks of what the Director mentioned, to say, in all the efforts of what we are trying to do, let us get people to work, because that is the ultimate goal to address the unemployment challenge. So, in addition to that, I also listened carefully to Dr. Philip, where she said, we really need to, in everything that we do, let us understand the structure of our local labor market. So, in that case, everything that has been discussed here, I didn't really get much around the efforts to really get people to work, particularly looking at the structure in terms of the skills composition of the labor force in the country. you check on the drawing from the labor market dynamics released by Stats SA, say for the trend from 2018 to 2021, about 69.5% of those who constitute the total employment cohort, they are low-skilled and semi-skilled workers. And that is where my question is, all these measures we are proposing, how sustainable are they going to draw people into employment? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess, yeah, if you can just pass the microphone to the lady with the shawl. So how are we getting those with limited or no skill into work, I think is the first question. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Mahlatsi Nkosi from Intellidex. My question is actually for Amanda. So she mentioned that we should have a cash in hand income, if I'm not mistaken, for 18 to 59. And I don't totally agree with that. And the reason why I actually want to ask you this is, would this just purely be a cash in hand grant that is being added? And does this not create a dependency, especially with the fiscal already being so overstretched? And my last bit of that is there any type of intervention that will assist those people who do get this, let's call it an unemployment grant, between those ages to enter the workforce, like being assigned a social worker and having a duration as to which they can actually receive that grant and then it gets cut off? Kind of having like a matchmaking thing to say that in order to continue having it, you need to show effort, that you've actively been looking for a job, consulting with the social worker, and it's justified to extend it past that period because you haven't found employment.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So, yeah, Amanda, how do we activate those who are recipients of that income transfer into the job search and ultimately into finding work? Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. My name is Aviwe Ongeya. I'm from the University of Pretoria. My question really is, I would love to know, first of all, I'm very disappointed, I would say. If we're going to talk about employment and unemployment, and no one of the panelists even touched about or talked about the role of the banking sector and essentially the central bank. In South Africa, we have a very weird central bank compared to other central banks, which only targets inflation, but doesn't talk anything about achieving full employment in the economy. And I understand that they are independent in executing their mandate. However, they are given their mandate by the government. So I would ask, why, first of all, didn't you guys even touch on the central bank or even the banking sector? Second of all, don't you think it would be a good idea that government revises the mandate and essentially make the central bank and the banking sector target employment? Because I believe they are very good and well-intentioned South Africans with good ideas, but they lack funding. Okay. It's hard to get credit in South Africa. And then, okay.
I said one input. I already gave you an opportunity to make 2 comments. So I was already remiss for that. But thank you very much, Aviwa, for that question. I know the Deputy Governor is also with us today. He's sitting at the back of the class, so you might want to just, after the response from the panelists, maybe pose the question to him too. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. So I had, is it on? I had two points, but Michael already made the point for me for the general equilibrium, so I leave that. My question was, when I keep looking at this title, and let's keep it there for now, rethinking, I was thinking, what have we rethought so far in these discussions? So when I came here, I thought we were going to say something like, maybe let's think of a conditional unemployment grant. So you condition the grant against you being in an enterprise of some sort, with support, of course, or in a farm, or something like that, or in a firm, as you're saying, Harold. Is that what we are doing? Or are we talking the same old, we want to have an unemployment benefit or support for people who do not have jobs between the age of 18 and 59, full stop? I thought I didn't hear the combination of these two. So I thought this is a a conditional unemployment grant for those who are unemployed so that they get employed after 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, or they employ others. That's my take. Thank you.
Okay, so please, if we can make a note of some of the other hands, because we are going to come back again. But let me, Dr. Phillips, start off by getting your response, and we'll work our way back. I think there's a lot of feedback as well, which I think we might want to engage. So, Dr. Kate?
So let me take the question about what is stopping the informal sector from growing. And I think there are a lot of dynamics, and I recognize that there's a different urban-rural dynamic. I don't think that makes a complete difference to the comparative statistics, and I think we must be careful of putting up the informal sector as the panacea of our employment trajectory and as providing all of the solutions. But I want to just add to some of the points I made about what is stopping the informal sector. So, the land dispossession thing in rural areas, it certainly is a big factor. The fact that forms of employment that are typically informal in other contexts, like domestic work, is a factor. But the big, not the elephant in the room, but the big issue that I think we need to talk about that refers also a little to what was being raised on the right here is the highly concentrated structure of our economy, highly unequal structure of the economy. Number one, we know from theory inequality constrains growth, but in our particular context, there is a particular structure to that economy that constrains small enterprise and informal enterprise development. And that is, very briefly, we had sanctions and we had foreign exchange controls that meant that South African capital couldn't be exported in the apartheid years. Unlike anywhere else in the world, mining capital reinvested in South Africa in consumption goods. Beer, maize meal, canned goods, tea, coffee, you name it. Any single item you want to name in the consumption basket of poor people is mass-produced in our core economy. In any other developing country in the world, the small-scale production of those items at a local level is the prime entry point for the informal sector. Making goods locally that you use yourself and that you know your neighbors need. That is the primary entry point into economic activity, and in South Africa it is blocked. Now, that's not the only factor. There are regulatory factors. There are the things that were pointed out, that the access issues, the red tape issues. There are these factors. But actually, the structure of our economy is a fundamental part of that picture that we can't ignore. And that's partly why we have such difficulty supporting and promoting the informal sector and small enterprise, even if it's formal. It is getting better. We're finding people being very entrepreneurial and opening new markets, township economies. There's interesting stuff happening. This is not a static terrain. But nevertheless, we must understand the context that makes it so hard for small enterprise to thrive. And that brings me also to the wider point about employment. Yes, it is true. We've ended up not talking a great deal about employment. And certainly, as I often argue, plan A is that we get the economy to deliver jobs. That is plan A. Can the A team make it happen? Because it's an absolute priority. But when we look at what's happening on the ground, that's not what's happening. We're seeing very constrained job growth. And that's the context in which we have to look at complementary strategies to get people working, to get people to work. And I'd like to just pick up very briefly on a point that Michael made. This is also why the kinds of jobs that are produced through the social provision of employment matters so much. And I couldn't agree more that if we're just going to displace existing police people with lower paid public employment, that is just displacement, and that is just going to discredit the model. And that's why things like social employment, where we are working with partners in communities to support what is called work for the common good through things like the Social Employment Fund, are so crucial. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Kate. Michael?
Yeah, I wonder which question I must answer.
Okay, then hand it over. Hand it over. Hand it over.
Next, okay. There's a lot. I'll leave the tax.
Think about it in the meantime.
I'll leave the tax to Sbu. But a lot of people did present various sizes of elephants. These are very tricky questions, and yeah, I'll try to tackle some of them. I'll start off with the employment topic. You are correct that we didn't really talk in great detail. I'll put a statistics that I often talk about, and that in Switzerland, 70% of the Swiss do not have university degrees, and only 30% have, and that's because what the equivalent of their matric is exceptionally good. So good that they get absorbed into the labor market through apprenticeship, and if they want to specialize, they can go into studying whilst working. So you don't use your job, you don't use a skill, you can study and work. And actually, if you look at South Africa and SOEs, a lot of Afrikaans speaking, and I'm sure some English, but I know that there has been this examples of SOEs providing similar support where people were absorbed without education and they gained their education up until attaining a PhD whilst working for your ESCOM and your ESCO and etc. And that support was provided. So again, we need to beef up our basic education. Second issue that I have with South Africa, having studied overseas as well, is that I would propose that we scrap our degrees. The way we look at the BA, BSc, in the UK, in the US, they don't use that categorization. Undergrad is a 4-year general degree. What this does is that when you come out of your matric and you want to go into university, you don't have to decide then and then that you're going to be a scientist, therefore you do a BSc, and when you're 2 years, 3 years into your BSc, you realize actually this is not what I thought this degree is about, therefore I'm going to start all over again or I'm going to drop out. So it just gives you that general degree, and what happens is that the absorption rate of those who receive this general degree is massive because they can go into various jobs, be it banking, consultancy, etc., without having to only go to banking once you've studied a BCom degree, which is what our system has done. So only those who've studied a BCom can go through a different stream. It causes a lot of also rigidity in just the labor absorption. So that is from my experience. And then when you specialize post-grad. So whoever wants to be a medical doctor or an economist or whatever, specialize, or lawyer, specialize after you've done your general degree. Sure. The other thing with South Africa is...
So let's pause on that, on those 2 points. We'll come back again. Remember, we've got a few other questions, but maybe...
Just one more.
Point. Okay.
That the pipeline from matric to getting to jobs... to work, job absorption in the country is only one. It's university. So there's no other real, TVETs, if you look at the unemployment numbers, the university unemployment numbers are highest at TVET level versus those who went to university. So we need to also provide other training facilities post-matric that could also be worthwhile and allow someone to get a job or work on their own, etc. And then there's the loan issue of, once you've got that brilliant matric because we've sorted out our basic education, what do? You've got a brilliant idea. That's where you talk about banks and allowing and having some level of enablers of entrepreneurship.
Okay, thanks for that, Tabi. That point around a general undergraduate, I think was made in the Sodin report also in 2009. And it's nearly 14 years later, so I don't know where we are on that. Sbusiso, I don't know if you want to quickly come in.
Yes, thanks.
And then Amanda, I see you're itching, so I'll come to you.
So in the interest of time, I think I'll cluster some of the questions together, but I want to start maybe with it's not so much of a cop-out, but just to note that this is going to be the first of a series of policy debates. And already as we are discussing and the questions coming in from the audience, taking note of maybe some of the topics that we could delve into with a little bit more detail. So please stay tuned. That's just my hat of SA Tired. So clustering around some of the questions. So on raising revenues, it'll be difficult to speculate because one of the things that needs to happen is the analysis needs to happen. But what we can say is that there's a very strong appreciation for the economic trade-off. the last few budget documents have spoken to a concept of tax buoyancy around how much tax you get from every R1 your economy creates. Unfortunately, we went sort of negative in the last few years, and that has implications as well for the ability of your economy to generate additional tax revenue. So I would encourage colleagues to please go look at the last few budget review documents. Then I'm going to cluster the questions around, there was questions around rethinking, so whether there was innovation or something new to be learned, and also around speaking to some of the fundamental challenges around the labor market. Regulation was brought up. And one of the things around regulation is a lot of it is anecdotal, and not to dismiss that, but one of the things that shows that the labor market is rigid and that it's not working as it could is that 80% of people who are unemployed have been unemployed for longer than a year. So once you fall out of the labor market system, there are significant barriers of re-entry, and that's something that an efficient labor market theoretically should not happen. So there are definite inefficiencies around how the labor market functions. There are definite challenges around the supply of labor, and again, that could be an entire policy debate on its own around what we do on the supply side. The fact that the economy has shifted in terms of which sectors are now more dominant in our economy and what that means for labor supply. That is a very important topic for further discussion. And the one thing to also say around growth is that I agree maybe with, I agree with Prof. Borat on factually, when we were growing between 2002 and 2007, we were growing almost at 5%. Our unemployment rate fell as low as 22%. So factually, we have to take that into account, that it's not the panacea necessarily, it's not the silver bullet, but without growth, it's a really difficult platform from which to create jobs. The last thing I'll say, and there was a question online as well around value of money. Yeah, last one is around value of money, so value for money. So the World Bank did a study recently to say there are, by their estimates, 106 active labor market policies across 20 departments in South Africa. And the figures that they could find, the expenditure amounted to around 97 billion rand a year. That again is 2% of GDP. In terms of whether we're getting value for money or sort of the outcomes of the spending is a crucial question, and I would implore us to maybe think about having a separate policy debate around that, because they could only find beneficiary numbers for 32 of these programs. Out of how many? Out of 106. Sure. And the beneficiaries total to around 4.8 million people. So again, these are important things, and we need the data to arm ourselves to come into these debates and really try and tackle the fundamental issues. And I really look forward to that in future policy debates. Thanks.
And I guess that touches on this question of complementarity and coordination between the different ones.
Yeah.
Prof, and then Amanda?
Yeah, I see you.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm already, no, that's fine. I'm already under siege. So,
We've been told to keep our answers short. So, seeing that nobody answered the undocumented workers as opposed to illegal immigrants, the reason there isn't any research is because there's no data, right? So we often, as economists, try and find the data, whether it's survey data or unofficial surveys, but I think that may be a request for the program to use sort of creative means to actually estimate the number of undocumented workers. I will say that in general, all the work around immigration would suggest that it's a net positive for employment and for growth around the world, developing countries included. So that's something to consider. I like Margaret's question because she was saying, okay, well, tell us what is new, right? And perhaps in a bitty way, I was getting to this idea of moving and shifting from households to firms. I don't think there's in any way one would see this as reductionist and only about the informal sector, right? I think the point is to switch the policy emphasis. We've constantly talked about employment generation, and then we're talking about households, talk about grants. In fact, if we start focusing on firms, I've popped a whole series of what I've called supply-side measures. So if you think of firms ranging in size from micro, informal, one-person firms right through to large capital-intensive operators, the infrastructure need for one-person informal sector operator is a stand, right? That won't get stolen. But on the other end, it's an efficient port for an exporter, right? Supply side incentives, the ETI could operate as a grant to informal sector operators, likewise, as it currently does, as a wage subsidy to formally listed firms. And so you can run through, deregulation is one example. So you need the Labour Relations Act to not extend agreements to non-bargaining council members for SMMEs. That's a very critical sort of almost busting up of high levels of concentration in certain sectors. But that doesn't matter to the informal sector. What the informal sector needs is deregulation in cities so that people outside of this venue could actually sell us food. So the way you start thinking about employment generation as a supply side measure is what I think is how to push that debate forward. Otherwise we come back to, Laffer curves and, whether that's, and dependence on the fiscus, frankly, right, is unimaginative, right? You've got to start thinking about the supply side and the range of tools you have available, not just the fiscus, but deregulation, infrastructure provision, and so on. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Amanda?
Thank you.
I could see you've been...
No, I think that I want to say that there's been a lot of things that have been presented as elephants in the room that are in fact red herrings. And these things have been used to scare us. So, and I see you're shaking your head at me. The issue of foreign nationals, the issue of overtaxing people, when Sibusiso tries to scare us with the fact that we don't know the value of $1 billion, but the 34 billion used, sorry Sibusiso, the 34 billion used for the SRD grant that he spoke about represented 2% of the budget. 2% of the budget to make sure that 7 million people don't go to bed hungry is value for money and must be increased. So and I hate to say it, but here's the elephant in the room. There is not enough jobs for the amount of people in South Africa who need jobs. So we don't discuss jobs today because they don't exist. There are not enough jobs in South Africa. We have structural unemployment. So it's not an issue of dependency. You could give someone a job seekers grant and they can spend 10 years and pray to every deity possible and get every degree, but there aren't enough jobs. Doesn't matter about your degree, doesn't matter about how long you spend, it doesn't matter about your job seekers grant. The jobs don't exist in South Africa. And that's the elephant in the room. And so what we have to do is, and Haruna said, what are we trying to plug? What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to plug poverty and hunger and inequality. And that can only be done through grants for those with little to no income between 18 to... So not just for everyone, although we do want universality in the end. But the thing is, there aren't jobs, and so we can be scared about taxes, we can be scared about corruption, we can be scared about foreign nationals as they've been presented to us by the media. But the truth of the matter is, there aren't jobs, people are hungry, grants alleviate poverty in the immediate.
Plus some opportunities through the social provision of
Yes, and so sorry, and I wanted to add in now, and you asked about activation, and this is I'm going to now...
That's the last point, because
yes, and I'll wrap
the organizers are going to kill me.
You asked about activation, and I want to say that our research on the ground, and obviously it's by speaking to grant beneficiaries, is that the SRD grant has activated people, not in the way that we think it does, so people use it so that they don't starve, but they also use it to sell fruits and veggies at the terminus. They also use it to buy fiber so that they can braid their neighbor's hair for some income. They also use it so that they can go and print their CV, drop off the taxi fare to drop off. So it is activating, and not in the way that we think it's going to activate the economy, but it is activating the informal economy. So there's no research to show that those who receive SRD grants have stopped looking for jobs if they were before.
Folks, I really wish we had probably another hour, because, even the labor demand story and the job search point Amanda just made, I think is borne out in some of the data coming out of our labor centers, where, people have been on the list for a decade in some cases. So it is something that hopefully, Sbusiso, we can think about in the next dialogue. But unfortunately, folks, we're going to have to wrap it up here. I've been given a very firm instruction. It reads as follows: Ayabonga, let us wrap up the discussion. 2 exclamation marks thereafter. So folks, thank you very much for coming through. And let me hand over to our colleagues at the UNU-University to wrap up and give us a vote of thanks. But really, thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon. It's been a really great discussion. And to my panelists, please give them a last round of applause. Unfortunately, they aren't able to make any closing remarks, but we can certainly have a discussion just as we wrap up. But unfortunately for this session, we've run out of time. Let me call up the director at the World Institute for Development Economics Research at the United Nations University to come and give us some closing remarks. Kunal Sen.
So apologies that I have to act as a spoilsport and bring this debate to a close with some closing remarks. But on the positive side, I'm standing meeting you and a very nice reception outside. Think about that, okay? So on behalf of UNU-WIDER, I wanted to thank you all for your participation, attendance in this event, the panelists, fantastic moderation, questions came from the floor. I'm sorry we couldn't take all the questions. But I think one thing that was interesting to me as an international observer, using Arun's term, first is that this discussion around grants-based schemes, a way to address this very, very important problem that South Africa faces, high and persistent unemployment, that we see there is no binary approach. The evidence on this is quite mixed, and which approach works, and there are many ways to slice the cake. And I think that's really, really interesting. But for me, that was not the only thing that I learned. The thing I learned was that this debate about pros and cons of SRD quickly spilled over into questions around, is South Africa a welfare state or a developmental state? Consumption-based growth, investment-based growth, redistribution, but not redistribution itself, redistribution of assets. So this debate on pros and cons SRD quickly became a debate that is pretty much around all the fundamental questions that South Africa faces, which is great, right? Maury, if I can speak on your behalf too, this is exactly what this debate series, the SETITE Econ 3x3 debate, is about, really. It's not about technicalities about one particular scheme. It's about the really big questions that South Africa is facing, and exactly this discussion we had today in the panel and on the Q&A exactly showed that. So I think it was really, really very, very limiting for me, myself, coming in as an outsider. So just a couple of words about UNU-WIDER. So it's a unique combination of a think tank, a research institute specializing in development economics, and a UN agency. We provide a range of services from policy advice to governments, as well as freely available research. So you go to our website, everything is downloadable, everything's open access, nothing is under a situation we cannot look at the research. We're very much committed to open access in everything we publish. So that's something we do. And I'm really proud that UNU-WIDER, along with the National Treasury of South Africa, has been part of SSTIDE since it started in 2017. We are now in the second phase, and it's really amazing how much we accomplished in the first phase, and I need to give a few numbers on this. So in the first phase, we achieved significant milestones. We published 180 research studies, built technical capabilities within the South African public service, awarded 11 pages scholarships to public servants. Additionally, more than 50 students got us with the Young Scholars Program. We organized policy dialogues and panel discussions to foster debate between research and practitioners. So that was the first phase, and we did a lot. The second phase of SETITE, which was launched last year, will continue until 2025, building upon the proven success of its key principles. What are they? Collaboration and inclusivity remains paramount throughout the entire program. We're going to bring in more and more early career scholars from other universities in South Africa and beyond, and try to make the program even more inclusive in the second phase. The programmatic pillars of research, capacity development, and policy bridging continues to be essential, with a commitment to establishing a world-class research infrastructure in National Treasury around South Africa's tax amnesty data remains unwavering. We're going to have a lot more data coming in. I hope some of you were there for the launch of the SET Spatial Data. The program was launched last week, I think. and just examples of how we're trying to bring in different kinds of data sets, admin data sets, into SATIDE. You're going to see a lot more of that in the next few years. Also, I want to just also thank Murray and people for the collaboration we have Econ 3x3 on this policy debate series. It's an exciting and promising endeavor for the program. As Sibu mentioned, this is just a start. We'll see more of this. It brings together expertise and insights of both organizations, Econ 3x3 and UNU-WIDER and National Treasury and others, creating a platform that brings together informed discussions and constructive exchange of ideas. The whole point is not to have one view. There are many more views that we need to bring in, and that's exactly the point. And no, UNU-WIDER and SATIDE does not duck away from difficult questions. There was a question that came from the audience. No, we don't do that. That's not our mission. I want to also encourage you to take a moment, explore the information packs which you have in front of you, to give you a sense of what we've been doing in SATIDE and Econ 3x3. You see 2 sheets. Both have QR codes. Scan the QR codes with your smartphones and discover SATIDE and Econ 3x3. So there's a lot waiting for you if you do that. So happy scanning. So in closing, I want to express my gratitude to our colleagues from the National Treasury. Many of you are here today, and so is Sibu here, and the South African Revenue Service for the partnership. Together, we formed strong networks and effective collaborations that will continue to enhance evidence-based policy formulations in the years ahead in SATIDE. I also want to thank the University of Pretoria and Professor Steve Cott sitting there in front of here, who really provided us in the generous hosting and the unwavering support. So it was really important for their support to have this particular event and wouldn't really have it possible. And thank you, Steve, for that. And none of this would have been also possible without the commitment and financial support of partners such as the UK's Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. I should also mention that. So before I close this event, there's a reception outside. Hopefully there's some nice things that you can find there, drinks and snacks, and let's go there right away. Thank you.